3 weeks after Daniel Harper's funeral, the city had just begun to breathe again. The news cycle had moved on. People still talked about the strange apology letter, but fear had softened into curiosity. Some believed it had been a personal matter. Others assumed the police were close to an arrest. They were wrong. On a rainy Thursday evening, Carla Ruiz finished her shift at a small marketing firm downtown. She texted her brother that she was heading to the grocery store before going home. Security cameras later showed her walking calmly through the aisles, pushing a cart, checking items off her phone. At 8:42 p.m., she stepped into the dimly lit parking lot carrying 2 bags of groceries. She never made it home. Her body was found the next morning inside her car. The engine was off. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. It looked, at first glance, as if she had simply fallen asleep in the driver's seat. But when officers approached, they noticed the same stillness, the same unnatural calm. And on the passenger seat beside her purse was a white envelope. Detective Marcus Hale felt a tightness in his chest when he arrived at the scene. He already knew what he would find before the envelope was even placed in his hands. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was the same. "I wish there had been another way. I carry the weight of this choice. I am sorry." No signature this time. Just the apology. Hale closed his eyes for a moment. 2 victims now. Same method. Same careful placement. Same tone. The medical examiner later confirmed Carla Ruiz had also been injected with a fast-acting toxin. The mark was barely visible beneath her collarbone. There were no signs of a struggle. Just like Daniel Harper, she likely never saw it coming. The press moved quickly. "Apology killer strikes again." One headline read. Reporters began asking whether a serial killer was on the loose. The mayor demanded updates. Citizens flooded police tip lines with theories and rumors. But Hale focused on the facts. He placed both letters side by side on his desk. He studied the curves of each word, the pressure of the pen, the spacing between lines. The second letter felt slightly longer, more personal. "I carry the weight of this choice." That wasn't something someone wrote casually. That was someone wrestling with guilt. The forensic team confirmed what Hale already suspected. Same ink brand, same type of paper, same handwriting. No fingerprints. No DNA. Clean again. But something else caught their attention. There were faint indentations on the second sheet, as if the writer had pressed down harder on certain words. Forensic imaging revealed a word written and then scratched out before the final version was completed. The scratched word was necessary. The killer had first written, "This was necessary," then crossed it out, and replaced it with, "I wish there had been another way." Hale stared at that detail for a long time. Necessary. That single word suggested motive. The killer believed the murders were justified, but still felt regret. The department began building timelines for both victims. They looked for connections, shared workplaces, mutual friends, shared neighborhoods. Nothing obvious appeared. Daniel Harper was an accountant with a quiet life. Carla Ruiz was a marketing assistant known for her kindness and love of animals. On the surface, they had nothing in common. But Hale knew better than to trust the safest. He ordered deeper background checks, old records, archived reports, anything that might connect the two. Days passed without progress. Then a third body was discovered. An elderly librarian named Margaret Ellis was found inside her small home on the east side of the city. A neighbor had called police after noticing her mail piling up. Margaret was found seated peacefully in her reading chair. A book rested open in her lap, and on the small table beside her, placed neatly next to a cup of untouched tea, was another white envelope. This letter was longer. "I told myself the first time would be the last. I promised I would stop. But promises are weak when the world refuses to fix what is broken. I am sorry for becoming this." Hale felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. 3 victims, 3 apologies, and now a confession of struggle. "I promised I would stop." That line confirmed it. The killer never intended to be a serial murderer. Something had changed after the first act, or perhaps something inside them had already been broken long before. The media frenzy intensified. Citizens demanded answers. People began avoiding parks and parking lots. Sales of home security systems increased overnight. But Hale focused on patterns. He placed photos of the 3 victims on a board in the investigation room. He studied their faces carefully. Daniel Harper, Carla Ruiz, Margaret Ellis. What connected them? The toxin used in all 3 murders was rare but accessible to medical professionals and certain laboratory workers. Hale ordered a list of everyone in the city with access to it. The list was long. Too long. He needed something more specific. Then, during a late-night review of Margaret Ellis's file, a detail stood out. 10 years earlier, Margaret had been investigated in connection with an assault case involving a teenage neighbor. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Hale immediately requested full files on Daniel Harper and Carla Ruiz again, this time looking further back. What he found made his stomach tighten. 5 years ago, Daniel Harper had been accused of domestic violence. The case was dismissed after the main witness refused to testify. 7 years ago, Carla Ruiz had testified in a trial involving her brother, who was accused of armed robbery. The case ended in acquittal due to insufficient evidence. Each victim had once been connected to a serious crime, and each had avoided conviction. Hale leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The killer wasn't choosing random targets. The killer was selecting people who had escaped justice. Suddenly the apology letters made chilling sense. You did not deserve this. Not innocent. Just not deserving death. In the killer's mind, there was a difference. 2 weeks later, the 4th victim was discovered. A young delivery driver named Kevin Patel was found in an alley behind a restaurant during his shift. The white envelope rested on his chest. This letter was even more personal. I cannot keep pretending this is justice. I see their faces at night. I hear their families crying. I am sorry for adding more pain to a world already full of it. Hale noticed something new. The killer was unraveling. The tone was shifting from apology to confession. The writer was struggling emotionally. That meant mistakes were possible. The forensic team analyzed the wax seal used on each envelope. It was blue, sealed with a small circular symbol pressed into it. The same symbol every time. They traced the wax brand to several local craft stores. Thousands had been sold. But then Hale made a different connection. The symbol itself. It looked familiar. He had seen it before. After hours of searching, he found it in an online support forum dedicated to people who had lost loved ones to violent crimes. The symbol represented closure and second chances. Hale felt a chill. The killer wasn't just targeting those who escaped justice. The killer might be connected to victims' families. Perhaps someone who had lost someone and believed the system had failed them. He ordered a cross-reference between the 4 victims and any individuals who had publicly accused them in past cases. The list was shorter now. Payne had a pattern, and somewhere in that pattern was a person who believed murder was correction. But as Hale stared at the apology letters spread across his desk, one thought refused to leave his mind. This killer felt remorse. Real remorse. And that meant something dangerous. Because a killer who feels nothing is predictable. A killer who feels guilt is unstable. And instability can lead anyway. The city now lived under a shadow. 4 victims. 4 letters. Each one revealing more about the writers in a conflict. Each one suggesting that the killer was not finished. Hale knew one thing with certainty. The next letter would tell them even more. And if they didn't stop this person soon, the apology would come too late for someone else. By the time the 4th body was buried, the city no longer felt safe. People locked their doors earlier. They avoided eye contact with strangers. Conversations in coffee shops grew quiet whenever someone mentioned the apology letters. Fear had settled into daily life like a shadow that refused to move. Detective Marcus Hale stood in front of the investigation board inside the homicide unit, staring at the photographs of the 4 victims. Daniel Harper, Carla Ruiz, Margaret Ellis, Kevin Patel. 4 faces. 4 lives ended without warning. And beneath each photograph, in careful plastic evidence sleeves, were copies of the letters. The handwriting looked almost peaceful. Gentle curves. Steady lines. No shaking. No rage pressed into the ink. But the words were changing. The killer was struggling. Hale tapped his pen lightly against his chin as he reviewed the connection they had uncovered. Each victim had once been accused of a serious crime. Each had walked free. The system had failed someone. And now someone was correcting it. Late that evening, as Hale scrolled through archived case files, he noticed something else. Several of the old accusations had one thing in common. The families of the alleged victims had attended a local therapy group for survivors of violent loss. The group was called Second Chances. It met every Wednesday evening in the basement of St. Mark's Church on the quiet north side of the city. Hale leaned back slowly in his chair. Second chances. The same phrase connected to the wax seal symbol found on every envelope. The circular stamp with a single line running through it. Closure. He didn't believe in coincidences. The next Wednesday evening, Hale parked his car a block away from St. Mark's Church. The building was small and modest, its brick walls worn by decades of rain and wind. A single light glowed in the basement windows. He adjusted his coat and stepped inside. The church smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax. A hallway led to a set of stairs descending underground. Voices drifted upward. Soft, calm, measured. Hale paused for a moment before walking down. The basement room was simple. Folding chairs arranged in a circle. A coffee table with paper cups and a metal thermos. A small shelf stacked with tissues. On the wall hung a printed sign with the group's name in gentle blue letters. Second Chances. About a dozen people sat in the circle. Men and women of different ages. Some held notebooks. Some stayed at the floor. The air felt heavy with shared pain. At the center of the circle stood Dr. Evelyn Moore. She appeared to be in her late 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair and calm, steady eyes. She wore a simple gray sweater and spoke with quiet confidence. "We're glad to welcome a new member tonight," she said gently as Hale entered. All eyes turned toward him. For a moment, he felt exposed. "My name is Marcus," he said, keeping his voice even. "I lost someone a few years ago. I thought, maybe this would help." Dr. Moore nodded kindly and motioned for him to sit. The meeting began with quiet introductions. One by one, members spoke about their losses. A son killed in a robbery. A sister lost to a drunk driver. A husband murdered during a convenience store holdup. The stories were heartbreaking. Raw. Honest. Hale listened carefully, not only to the words but to the tone. The anger. The sorrow. The resentment. He watched faces closely. One man caught his attention. Thomas Reed. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke about his daughter, Lily, who had died in a hit-and-run accident 8 years earlier. "The driver walked free," Thomas said quietly. "Not enough evidence. They said there wasn't proof he was behind the wheel. I see him sometimes, living his life like nothing happened." Hale's chest tightened. Daniel Harper, the first victim. After the meeting ended, Hale lingered near the coffee table. He noticed something sitting beside a stack of blank stationery. A small wooden box. Inside was several sticks of blue sealing wax, the exact same shade used on the envelopes. His pulse quickened. Dr. Moore approached him with a gentle smile. "First meetings are always the hardest," she said. He nodded. "It's helpful to hear others talk." She studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp but kind. Healing takes time. As he left the church that night, Hale felt certain they were close to something important. The following morning, he ordered background checks on every member of the therapy group. 12 names. 12 histories of loss. The pattern was undeniable. Each member had once been connected to someone accused of a crime who had avoided conviction. But that didn't mean they were killers. Grief did not equal guilt. Still, one name kept rising to the top. Thomas Reed, the man who lost his daughter in a hit-and-run. The driver accused in that case had been Daniel Harper, the first victim. Hale arranged to bring Thomas in for questioning. Thomas sat across from him in the interview room, hands folded tightly together. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. "You were aware Daniel Harper died?" Hale asked carefully. Thomas swallowed. "Yes, I saw it on the news." "How did it make you feel?" Silence filled the room. "Relieved," Thomas finally admitted. "I won't lie to you. I felt relief." Hale leaned forward slightly. "Did you kill him?" Thomas's eyes widened in shock. "No, I would never. I couldn't." "You said you see him sometimes, living his life. Did you ever confront him?" Thomas shook his head. "I wanted to, so many times, but I didn't." Hale studied his face carefully. There was anger there, pain, but not something else. Not guilt. They searched Thomas's home with a warrant. They found photographs of Lily, old court documents, grief counseling pamphlets, but no blue wax, no letters, no toxins, nothing. Hale left the house feeling unsettled. If not Thomas, then who? He returned to the therapy group the next week, again under his false identity. This time, he paid closer attention to the smaller details. Who spoke less than others? Who seemed detached? Who avoided eye contact? One woman, a nurse named Rachel, rarely spoke. She had lost her brother to a bar fight. The suspect was acquitted. A retired police officer named Carl had lost his son during a botched robbery investigation. The accused were released due to procedural errors. Everyone in the room carried pain. But pain alone did not make a murderer. As the meeting ended, Hale noticed something else. Dr. Moore gathered the group's written exercises from the table. Sometimes writing helps, she explained, even if the words are never sent. Hale watched as she collected sealed envelopes from several members. Each was closed with blue wax. The same ritual, the same symbol. Closure. Later that night, Hale reviewed the latest apology letter again. He noticed something subtle in the phrasing. I see their families crying. Plural. Families. Not one specific loss. That suggested the killer wasn't avenging only one tragedy. They were connected to multiple cases. Or they felt connected through the group. The idea formed slowly in his mind. What if the killer wasn't acting alone? What if the therapy group had unknowingly inspired someone? A person who listened to every story, absorbed every injustice. Someone who believed they were helping. The following week, a breakthrough came from forensic analysis. Tiny traces of candle soot were found on the edges of the fourth envelope. The wax had been melted using an open flame, not a lighter. Hale immediately thought of the church basement. Candles lined the walls during each meeting. He returned once more, this time observing more boldly. As the session ended, he approached Dr. Moore privately. You must hear a lot of anger in this room, he said. She nodded slowly. Anger is part of grief. Has anyone here ever talked about revenge? She met his gaze calmly. We talk about feelings. Acting on them is another matter. Her expression was steady. Too steady. Hale left the church that night with more questions than answers. The therapy group was clearly connected, but the killer was careful. Careful enough to hide in plain sight. Careful enough to turn grief into something darker. And as Hale drove home under the dim streetlights, one thought echoed in his mind. The killer was sitting in that circle, listening, sharing, healing, or pretending to. And if he didn't uncover the truth soon, the next apology letter would already be written. Detective Marcus Hale sat in his office late at night, staring at the growing board of victims. Daniel Harper, Carla Ruiz, Margaret Ellis, Kevin Patel, each photo pinned carefully, each one beneath a copy of the letters that had haunted the city for months. The handwriting was the same, the words shifting subtly from sorrow to confession, and yet the identity of the killer remained a mystery. The city had grown anxious. Panic was spreading quietly through neighborhoods. People avoided parks, parked far from stores, and whispered about the apology killer in cafes and offices alike. Hale rubbed his eyes and poured himself a cup of stale coffee. He had been chasing shadows for weeks. He had sifted through endless records, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and yet, the trail never led anywhere solid. The connection to the therapy group, Second Chances, was undeniable. Every victim had previously escaped justice in some way. Every victim had someone in their life who had suffered because of them. The patterns were there, but nothing concrete linked any member to the crimes. Then Thomas Reed emerged as the obvious suspect. The man had lost his daughter, Lily, in a hit-and-run. The driver had walked free. Daniel Harper, the first victim, was the driver. The motive seemed clear. Revenge. That one connection was enough to draw Hale's focus. Thomas was brought in for questioning under the guise of a routine interview. The room was stark, fluorescent lights casting shadows across the walls. He sat with his hands folded tightly, shoulders hunched, and eyes downcast. Hale studied him carefully. Thomas seemed fragile, a man broken by grief. You were aware Daniel Harper died, weren't you? Hale asked, keeping his voice even but probing. Thomas's throat moved, swallowing. Yes, I heard. On the news. And how did that make you feel? Hale pressed gently. There was silence. Then, in a quiet voice, Thomas admitted, relieved, "I won't lie." He looked up, eyes pleading. "I wanted justice for Lily. I wanted him to pay. But I didn't do anything." Hale studied him for a long moment. Pain was written on every line of his face, but there was no malice, no admission, only grief. "Did you ever think about confronting him?" Hale asked. "No," Thomas replied firmly. "I could never. I wanted it to end without me doing anything wrong." The interview ended, and Hale felt a mix of relief and unease. Thomas Reed was angry, yes, but he wasn't the killer. Searching his home turned up nothing. No wax, no letters, no toxins. Only grief. Hale returned to the investigation board with a heavy sense of frustration. If it wasn't Thomas, then who? He went back to the therapy group. This time, he observed more carefully. He noted the small details. Who spoke the least? Who seemed the most controlled? Who handled the letters and materials? Everyone carried pain. Everyone seemed fragile in their own way. But one person drew Hale's attention more than others, Dr. Evelyn Moore, the group leader. She moved with precision, collected letters, and oversaw exercises with an unshakable calm. Hale arranged another session, this time pretending to be a volunteer again. He paid close attention to Dr. Moore's movements, her interactions, and the way she handled the wax seals. She melted them carefully, pressing the circular symbol into each envelope. That symbol matched the one found on every letter. One night, Hale stayed late, pretending to clean up while others left. He watched as Dr. Moore collected the written exercises, sealing them meticulously. He noticed the way her hands lingered over certain letters longer than necessary, as if ensuring they were exactly perfect. He felt a chill. Could she have the knowledge and skill to create the apology letters? The following day, forensic analysis brought the first shocking clue. A partial fingerprint was lifted from the envelope of the latest letter. It did not match Thomas Reed, but it did match someone on the therapy group's membership list. Dr. Evelyn Moore. Hale felt the room shift as he processed this information. Dr. Moore, the psychologist, the calm, compassionate leader who guided the grieving? Could she really be involved? He arranged to bring her in for questioning. Dr. Moore entered the room with composure, her eyes steady. She greeted Hale politely and took the chair opposite him. Hale could see no outward sign of guilt, only calm and reason. "Dr. Moore," Hale began carefully, "we have evidence linking you to the letters left at the crime scenes." She paused. Not a flicker of fear, not a tremor. She simply sighed and leaned back. "Yes," she said softly. "I wrote the letters." Hale blinked. "You did? All of them?" She nodded. "Yes, but I did not kill anyone." The room went silent. Hale struggled to process the revelation. She admitted writing the letters. But why? Dr. Moore began to explain. Months earlier, one of her patients had confessed violent thoughts during a session. He spoke of hurting people he believed had wronged him, those who had escaped justice. Dr. Moore reported the threat to authorities but continued observing the group. When the murders began, she discovered that the person she suspected had indeed begun acting on these thoughts. She revealed that she had been placing apology letters at the scenes before the police could arrive, attempting to leave clues while buying time for investigators. The letters were her attempt to humanize the victims and perhaps slow the killer's momentum. Hale leaned forward, stunned. "You risked being accused. You could have been arrested." Dr. Moore nodded. "I had no choice. I had to keep following the trail without tipping him off. But it was too late for the first few." Hale pressed further. "How did you get to the crime scenes first? That requires knowledge and timing beyond most civilians." Her eyes softened, but her tone remained factual. "I had access to the emergency response communications. My brother works in dispatch. I watched reports in real time. I never interfered with evidence, only made sure the letters reached the right hands." Hale's mind spun. She was involved, yes, but not as the killer. She was trying to stop him, or at least guide investigators closer. Yet she had manipulated crime scenes enough that suspicion naturally fell on her. Then, she leaned in slightly, a subtle shift in demeanor. "Detective, the fingerprint on the last letter. I left it there intentionally. I knew it would lead to me. It was a calculated risk." Hale froze. Why would you do that? To force his hand, she said quietly. I knew he would notice, and I knew I needed to understand who he really was before more people died. Hale realized that Dr. Moore had been playing a dangerous game. She was inside the investigation from the start, guiding it without exposing the killer. She had risked everything, including her own freedom, to get closer to the truth. Yet the real twist was still unknown. The letters, the pattern, the meticulous placement, they all pointed to a careful mind, but a mind consumed with grief and guilt. Dr. Moore's involvement was protective, but the killer was clever, calculating, and still active. Hale returned to the evidence board, staring at the photos of the 4 victims and the letters beside them. Dr. Moore's confession answered some questions but raised others. If she wasn't the murderer, then someone within her circle, someone with access to her methods, had to be. He revisited every detail. The blue wax, the symbol, the precise placement of letters, the timing, the selection of victims. Everything pointed to someone intelligent, careful, and intimately aware of the investigation itself. Dr. Moore had been careful, Hale realized, but she could not control the killer. She had only managed to slow him, delay him, and perhaps confuse him. That confusion had allowed the police to notice patterns they otherwise might have missed. Hale decided to dig deeper into the therapy group, their schedules, and their connections. He analyzed who had the ability to move unnoticed, who had knowledge of the emergency systems, and who carried personal motives tied to the victims. The profile began to form. The killer was someone who could think like the police, someone who could anticipate their actions, someone who had intimate knowledge of loss, grief, and justice. As the investigation progressed, Hale began to realize something terrifying. The killer had been inside the group all along, listening to stories, watching the grief, feeling the rage, and using it to justify their actions. The killer wasn't random. The killer wasn't Thomas Reed. The killer was closer than anyone could imagine. The city was no longer just fearful. It was teetering on the edge of panic. Residents avoided the streets where previous victims had been found. Children were kept indoors. Families whispered late at night, wondering if the next letter would be pinned to someone they knew. Hale felt the pressure. The longer the killer remained free, the more dangerous they became. Every move had to be calculated, every lead examined, every pattern scrutinized. Dr. Moore remained cooperative, but Hale knew he could not fully trust anyone. Not yet. She had the knowledge. She had access. She could have guided the investigation toward the wrong suspect if she wanted. Yet she hadn't. She had only sought to stop the killer. And the killer was still out there. By the end of the week, Hale had a list of new potential suspects. Members of the therapy group. People who had access to the meetings, the wax, the emergency information. And one name kept rising above the rest, though Hale dared not act yet. He needed proof. Absolute, undeniable proof. Anything less would be a disaster. Arrest the wrong person, and the killer would slip away. And if Hale was wrong again, the city would pay the price. He stared at the evidence board one last time before leaving his office. The apology letters, the victims, the therapy group, and now Dr. Moore's confession, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to be solved. And yet, somewhere, the real killer was watching, waiting, carefully planning the next move. Hale's gut told him one thing with certainty. The killer was not done. Not yet. And this time, the apology would be for someone entirely unexpected. The city, Hale knew, was about to face a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. Detective Marcus Hale had reached the point where exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. Weeks of chasing leads, revisiting old evidence, and interviewing members of the therapy group had brought him closer to the truth than ever before. But the final piece of the puzzle remained frustratingly elusive. The city was on edge. News outlets continued to speculate wildly about the apology killer. The public feared walking alone at night. Parents kept their children inside, and adults double-checked locks and alarms obsessively. Hale sat in his office, the walls plastered with photographs of the victims, maps of the city, and timelines of the murders. Each letter was pinned with care. The beautiful, terrible handwriting like a thread connecting 4 lives lost and the killer's agonizing conscience. He had spent hours reading them over and over. Each one revealed more about the person behind the crimes. They weren't motivated by malice, he realized. They were motivated by grief, by anger twisted into something monstrous, and, strangely, by guilt. The killer seemed to hate what he was doing, yet could not stop. Dr. Evelyn Moore had admitted to writing the letters, but her version of events seemed incomplete. Hale had observed her for weeks. She was calm, professional, compassionate, but she had access to the group's materials, the wax, the symbol, the scheduling of meetings. She could have committed the murders if she wanted. Yet there was a quiet conviction in her explanation that she was attempting to guide the investigation, to delay the killer, to confuse him with her own involvement. Hale knew the truth was closer than anyone suspected, and now, he believed he could see it. He reviewed the events from the very beginning. Daniel Harper had been killed first. The initial letter, with its polite apology, had seemed almost gentle. The second, placed next to Carla Ruiz, revealed the killer's struggle, regret creeping into guilt. Margaret Ellis and Kevin Patel showed escalation, longer letters, more confessions, acknowledgement of the ongoing battle within the killer's mind. Each victim had previously escaped justice, each had left someone grieving, and each was connected to the therapy group through the concept of loss. Then it hit him. The killer had been inside the investigation from the start. Someone with knowledge, access, and control. Someone who could anticipate police movements, who knew the way evidence was collected, who understood timing. Someone who could manipulate people's perception of guilt. Someone who could guide suspicion onto Thomas Reed or even Dr. Moore herself. Hale's mind raced through the suspects again. The therapy group members. The relatives of the victims. But one idea, almost too horrifying to consider, settled at the forefront. The killer was someone who had been trusted all along. Someone respected. Someone in a position of authority. Someone no one would suspect. He replayed every meeting, every conversation, every interaction he'd observed. Every subtle detail, every slight anomaly, every word Dr. Moore had said. And then it struck him. The killer had been in every step of the investigation. They had knowledge of police procedure, of forensic collection. They had been able to manipulate timelines. They had orchestrated confusion, carefully crafting letters that pointed toward Dr. Moore, toward Thomas, toward anyone but themselves. And then the unthinkable became clear. He, the detective, Marcus Hale, was the killer. Hale sat back in his chair and stared at the board. His thoughts became a torrent, a whirlwind of memory and suppressed pain. Years ago, his wife had been killed during a robbery. The suspect had walked free. Lack of evidence. The legal system had failed him. The grief, the rage, the sense of injustice had never left him. It had simmered quietly, unnoticed, while he continued his life, his work, his career as a detective. He had joined the therapy group under the guise of a volunteer, listening to others' stories, observing their pain, absorbing their anger. The group had become both a mirror and a spark. The tales of injustice resonated with him, but instead of catharsis, they ignited something darker, a desire to act where the law had failed, a belief that he could correct the system himself. He remembered Daniel Harper, the man who had killed Thomas Reed's daughter, the first victim. Hale had rationalized that Harper had escaped justice once, and now, in his hands, justice would finally be served. Then Carla Ruiz, Margaret Ellis, Kevin Patel, each a continuation of the same idea. Not random victims. Chosen carefully. They had evaded consequences, they had caused suffering, and Hale had convinced himself he was restoring balance. The apology letters had been real. He had written them, yes, but they were meant to soothe himself as much as anyone else. He was sorry, so deeply sorry. That was why the words were tender, careful, and full of regret. They reflected his internal struggle. He hated what he had done even as he justified it. He saw their lives as collateral damage in his twisted pursuit of closure. He remembered Dr. Moore's presence in the group. She had observed him, studied him, and unknowingly guided him further into the role of manipulator and orchestrator. Her letters, her actions, had pushed him to become even more precise, more careful, more meticulous in his work. Every step had been a balance of guilt and compulsion. Then, weeks later, she had slipped. During a private session, Hale had mentioned details of a murder scene that no one should have known. Her eyes had widened slightly. Her voice had caught in the throat, and she had realized the truth before anyone else. She had begun following him discreetly, understanding who the real killer was. She had planted evidence, manipulated leads, and guided the investigation toward himself without realizing it. She had tried to force a confession indirectly. Hale thought of the final letter, the one never delivered. It had been carefully drafted, perfectly aligned on the page, sealed with blue wax, and ready to be left at the scene of his last intended victim. In it, he confessed his deepest truth, his grief, his guilt, his warped justification. I am sorry for pretending this was justice. It was never justice. It was grief turned into violence. And that is my greatest crime. He had never intended anyone to read it. It was a private acknowledgement of his own monstrosity. The reality of his own actions struck him with staggering force. Every victim, every life lost, every tear shed, he had convinced himself it was necessary. But now, staring at the board and the carefully organized letters, he knew it had been selfish, a way to channel his pain, to give meaning to grief that he could not otherwise process. He had become the very thing he despised, a killer consumed by his own unresolved loss. By the time Hale finally returned to the station, the realization was complete. He had to confess. He could no longer manipulate evidence, hide behind others' suspicions, or continue the charade. The city, the families, the victims, they deserved the truth, and he could not carry this alone any longer. Dr. Moore had already begun piecing together what she knew. She had discovered the wax kit in Hale's personal storage, hidden among files and personal documents. She had noticed the handwriting, the phrasing, the subtle ways the letters evolved. Everything pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the investigation, and her intuition had led her to the person she least suspected. Hale requested a meeting with Dr. Moore at the church basement, under the pretense of discussing new leads. He arrived first, sitting in one of the folding chairs, hands clasped tightly. He watched her enter slowly, the faint light of candles casting shadows across her face. She nodded at him and took a seat across from him. The quiet between them was almost suffocating. I know, she said finally, her voice calm but firm. Hale's head lowered. I know, he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't hide it anymore. Every step, every calculation, it was me. She didn't flinch. She had prepared herself for this moment, had gathered evidence, had guided the investigation. Her expression was steady, professional, but her eyes betrayed sadness. You're confessing, she said simply. Yes, Hale said, the words bitter on his tongue. It started with my wife. The anger, the grief. I convinced myself I could make the world right, but I became worse than those I despised. I thought I was delivering justice, but it wasn't justice. It was violence, and I am responsible for every life I took. He pulled out the final letter, the one never delivered, and placed it on the table. This was meant for the last victim, but it's mine now. He exhaled sharply. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. Dr. Moore picked up the letter slowly, her eyes scanning the words. It's the truth, she said, her voice steady. It confirms what I suspected. You couldn't stop, even when you wanted to. The remorse is real, but the actions, they are unforgivable. Hale nodded. I know. I'll face the consequences. I'll accept whatever sentence comes. Over the next several hours, Hale provided full statements, leading authorities to evidence he had hidden in his home. Drafts of the letters, the wax seals, detailed lists of intended victims, and the means by which he had planned each murder. It was an exhaustive confession, thorough and unflinching. He took full responsibility, sparing no detail. Every misstep, every rationalization, every internal battle was laid bare. The city slowly began to understand. Hale's confession made headlines, shocking the public to its core. A respected detective, a man trusted to uphold the law, had committed these crimes. But unlike many murderers, he had confessed fully, driven by the same guilt that had defined each letter. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The therapy group continued to meet, though the atmosphere was forever changed. Dr. Moore stayed on as leader, guiding members through grief and recovery. The apology letters, once symbols of horror and confusion, were now locked in evidence storage, a chilling reminder of what grief unchecked can become. In the end, the apology killer was not motivated by hatred, not by anger, not by power. He was motivated by loss, by grief, and by a misguided belief that he could right the wrongs of a broken system. The letters, carefully crafted and sincere in their remorse, were both a confession and a warning. Even the most compassionate, the most respected among us, can be driven to unimaginable acts when pain and guilt go unresolved. And so the city healed slowly, with scars unseen but deeply felt. The victims were remembered, their families mourning still, but finally aware of the truth. And somewhere in a prison cell, Marcus Hale sat quietly, rereading his own words, knowing that sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not out of malice, but out of the desperate desire to fix a world that will never be perfect. The final letter remained sealed in evidence, a symbol of both justice and tragedy. It was a reminder that the line between right and wrong is fragile, and that even those sworn to protect can sometimes fall into darkness. The apology letters had told a story, and now the story was complete. Grief, guilt, and remorse had created a killer, but in the end, the truth brought closure, even if it came too late for those who had suffered most. The city would remember the apology killer not for the words he wrote, but for the lives he took, the grief he caused, and the haunting lesson that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who hide behind masks of virtue, waiting for the moment when pain becomes action, and action becomes tragedy. Justice had been served, but the memory of the letters, the calm, sorrowful handwriting, and the apology that never healed would linger forever. Hale's story, his confession, and the letters became part of the city's dark history. They served as a warning, a tale of grief and human frailty, a reminder that even those sworn to uphold the law can be consumed by loss, and that remorse, no matter how deep, cannot undo what has already been done. The apology killer was gone. The letters remained, and the lessons of loss, guilt, and vengeance would echo through the city for generations. The first body was found on a cold October morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the quiet city. A thin layer of fog hovered above the grass in Maplewood Park, soft and gray like a blanket that refused to lift. The air smelled of wet leaves and early frost. It was the kind of peaceful morning where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. At exactly 6:17 a.m., a jogger named Melissa Grant slowed her pace near one of the park benches. She noticed something strange lying near the walking path. At first, she thought it was a pile of clothes or someone sleeping under a coat. That wasn't unusual in that part of town. But as she stepped closer, her heart began to pound. A man was lying on his back, completely still. His eyes were open, staring at the pale sky above him. Melissa froze. For a moment, she told herself he might just be unconscious. Maybe he had fainted. Maybe he needed help. She rushed forward and called out to him, her voice shaking. There was no response. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed emergency services. As she waited for help to arrive, she noticed something that made her stomach turn. Pinned neatly to the man's jacket, right over his chest, was a white envelope. It looked deliberate, careful, not random. Within minutes, police cars and an ambulance filled the park entrance. Officers quickly secured the area. Paramedics checked the man, but it was already clear he was gone. His name, they would soon learn, was Daniel Harper, 43 years old. Accountant, divorced, no children. He lived alone in a small apartment 15 minutes from the park. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruises on his hands, no torn clothing. His wallet was still in his pocket, containing cash and credit cards. His expensive watch remained on his wrist. Nothing suggested robbery. Detective Marcus Hale arrived 20 minutes later. He stepped out of his car slowly, his long coat brushing against his knees as he walked under the yellow police tape. Hale was a tall man in his early 40s with sharp features and tired eyes. He had worked homicide for nearly 15 years. He had seen anger. He had seen revenge. He had seen cruelty beyond words. But he had never seen this. An officer handed him the white envelope using gloved hands. It was plain. No address. No name written on the outside. Just clean, white paper sealed carefully at the edge. Found pinned to him, the officer said quietly. Hale nodded and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat and steady, almost elegant. He read the words silently at first. I am deeply sorry for what I have done. You did not deserve this. This was not personal. Please forgive me. A friend. Hale read it again, and then a third time. He felt a strange chill run down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the October air. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a message meant to scare the public. It wasn't a confession filled with pride or hatred. It was an apology. He looked back at Daniel Harper's body. The man's face was calm. Too calm. As if he had simply fallen asleep. The medical examiner on scene gave a preliminary observation. There were no visible wounds. No blood. No gunshot. No stab marks. It appeared to be poisoning. Possibly an injection. They would know more after the autopsy. Hale slipped the letter into an evidence bag. Check for cameras, he said firmly. Every entrance to the park. Every nearby street. Officers began canvassing the area. But Maplewood Park had limited surveillance. Only one working camera near the parking lot. If the killer had entered from the wooded side, there would be no footage at all. Hale walked slowly around the scene. He studied the ground. The grass was damp but undisturbed. No clear footprints. No dropped items. Whoever had done this had been careful. Too careful. Back at the station, news of the strange letter spread quickly. Word traveled fast in a police department. Officers whispered in hallways. Some called it creepy. Others called it staged. Hale sat alone in his office and placed the letter on his desk. He leaned back in his chair and stared at it. I am deeply sorry. He had read many killer notes over the years. Most were filled with anger. Some were childish. Some were desperate attempts to shift blame. This one felt different. It felt sincere. That was what bothered him most. Later that afternoon, the autopsy report confirmed the cause of death. Daniel Harper had been injected with a rare but fast-acting toxin. The injection mark was small, almost invisible near the base of his neck. He would have lost consciousness within minutes. There were no defensive wounds. No signs of restraint, which meant Daniel Harper likely never saw it coming. Or he trusted the person who got close enough to him. Hale requested a full background check on the victim. Financial records, phone logs, emails. He wanted to know everything. But as hours passed, nothing unusual surfaced. Daniel Harper had no criminal record, no recent threats, no suspicious financial activity. His co-workers described him as quiet and polite. His ex-wife said they had divorced peacefully 2 years earlier. There was no obvious motive. By evening, the local news stations had picked up the story. Man found dead in park with mysterious note. Reporters speculated about a possible serial offender. Social media began buzzing with theories. Some believed it was a mercy killing. Others believed it was a twisted prank. Hale ignored the noise. He focused on the handwriting. He requested forensic analysis immediately. Ink type, paper source, pressure patterns, any detail that could lead somewhere. The results would take time. That night, Hale drove home long after sunset. His house was quiet, almost too quiet. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, replaying the scene in his mind. The envelope had been placed carefully, pinned straight, not rushed. The words were chosen thoughtfully. You did not deserve this. That line stuck with him. If the victim didn't deserve it, why kill him? Unless the killer believed something else. The next morning, the forensic team reported no usable fingerprints on the letter. Whoever handled it had worn gloves. The paper was common, purchased at any office supply store. No DNA. No trace evidence. Clean. Professional. But Hale knew one thing for certain. This was not random violence. This was planned. And the apology meant something. 2 days later, Daniel Harper's funeral was held in a small chapel. Friends and co-workers gathered in shock and confusion. Police officers attended quietly, observing faces, watching reactions. Hale stood near the back, studying the room. Grief filled the space, but no one looked afraid. No one looked guilty. After the service, Harper's ex-wife approached Hale. Did he suffer? She asked softly. Hale paused before answering. No, he said honestly. It was quick. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Who would do something like this? That was the question everyone was asking, and Hale had no answer. Yet, 3 weeks later, the answer would grow darker, because Daniel Harper would not be the last. But on that first cold October morning, as the fog finally lifted from Maplewood Park, the city had no idea that the white envelope pinned to one man's chest was the beginning of something far more disturbing. a killer who felt guilt, a murderer who apologized, and a mystery that was only just beginning.